The notice was taped to my front door at 7 in the morning, which was already a power move I had to respect in a twisted sort of way. 7 in the morning. In January. In the middle of a week when the temperature hadn't climbed above 12 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 straight days, and the roads in our neighborhood looked like a skating rink that God had personally polished overnight. Someone had physically walked up my driveway, across the icy path, climbed my porch steps, and taped a piece of paper to my door before most normal human beings had even considered opening their eyes. That someone was Janet Sinclair. I knew it before I even read the thing. I recognized the paper cream-colored cardstock, the kind she special ordered for HOA business, because she thought it looked more official than regular printer paper. I recognized the font Times New Roman, size 12, with the HOA logo she'd personally designed in Microsoft Word centered at the top like a royal seal. And I recognized the smell of her perfume still clinging faintly to the edge of the paper, because it was cold outside and scent travels differently when everything is frozen. I stood there in my doorway in my flannel pajamas, coffee mug in hand, steam curling up into the frigid air, and I read it. Dear Mr. Warren, it began, which was already a bad sign because Janet only used last names when she was in full HOA enforcement mode. It has come to the attention of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association that your property is currently in violation of HOA community standards, specifically Section 4, subsection C, regarding the maintenance of exterior structures in a safe and aesthetically acceptable condition. The icicles currently hanging from your gutters are considered a safety hazard and an aesthetic violation. You are hereby notified that these icicles must be removed by 12:00 p.m. today. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $250, with an additional daily fine of $50 for each day of continued noncompliance. The HOA board has the authority to impose these fines under the Community Rules and Regulations, Article 7. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time just to make sure I hadn't somehow misread it, and it was actually about something reasonable. I had not misread it. Janet Sinclair was fining me for icicles. Now I want to paint you a picture of what my gutters actually looked like at that moment, because context matters here. We had gotten 16 inches of snow over the previous weekend. 16 inches. After the snowfall, the temperature had dropped to a brutal low of -4 degrees, and then we'd had a brief warm-up to about 28 degrees, which was just warm enough to let the snow on my roof melt a little before the temperature crashed back down to single digits. The result, as any homeowner in a cold climate will tell you, was a spectacular and completely unavoidable row of icicles hanging from my gutters. They were impressive, actually. Some of them were probably close to 2 feet long. They sparkled in the weak January sunlight like nature's own chandeliers. My neighbor Tom from across the street had actually walked over 2 days ago and said, and I quote, "Man, those are some serious icicles. That's almost beautiful in a completely terrifying way." Every single house on my street had icicles. Every single one. I could see them from my porch right now, hanging from Kevin's place on the left, from the Delgados on the right, from every roofline up and down Birchwood Lane in both directions as far as I could see. It looked like the whole neighborhood had been dipped in ice, except, mysteriously, for Janet Sinclair's house. Janet lived 4 houses down from me on the same side of the street. Her house, a beige colonial with black shutters that she maintained with the obsessive precision of someone who considered their home a personal monument, was conspicuously icicle-free. This was not because Janet had some special gutter setup or heated cables or anything practical like that. No, this was because Janet had hired someone to come remove her icicles 2 days ago. I had seen the truck. I had watched a guy in crampons go up on her roof while I was shoveling my own driveway. I had waved. He had waved back. It was very pleasant. Now Janet was standing at her kitchen window at 7 in the morning watching me read the notice she'd taped to my door, and I could just feel it. I went back inside, set my coffee down, and started thinking. The first thing I did was take photographs. I grabbed my phone and walked back out onto my porch still in my pajamas. I'm not proud of it, but the documentation had to happen immediately, and I photographed my gutters and their icicles from multiple angles. Then I walked to the end of my driveway and I photographed the entire street. Kevin's icicles, the Delgado's icicles, the Martinez family's icicles 3 houses down, the Pattersons at the corner, every single house with icicles hanging from them in plain and obvious view. I took about 30 photographs, timestamp verified by my phone, in the 7:15 a.m. range on a Tuesday in January. Then I went inside and made a second cup of coffee because I needed it. My name is Neil Warren. I'm 41 years old. I moved to Maplewood Estates about 3 years ago when I relocated for work. It's a nice neighborhood, genuinely nice, not in a sarcastic way. The houses are well maintained, the streets are quiet, there's a little park at the end of the main road where people walk their dogs, and in the summer the whole place looks like something off a greeting card. I like my neighbors. Kevin next door is a good guy who helps me with yard stuff in exchange for me helping him with anything tech-related. The Delgados on my other side are a great family, and Maria Delgado makes tamales every Christmas and brings a plate over, and I genuinely look forward to that more than most things in December. The HOA, though. The HOA was another matter entirely. The HOA was Janet Sinclair. That's not entirely accurate, technically. There was a full board, 5 members, including a treasurer named Phil, who was a pretty reasonable guy, a secretary named Donna, who mostly went along with whatever Janet said, and 2 other members who sort of rotated in and out and generally kept their heads down. But Janet was the president, had been for 4 years, and she ran that board like it was her personal fiefdom. She set the agenda, she wrote the notices, she decided which complaints got investigated and which got dismissed, and she had apparently developed a personal interest in my property that had been increasing in intensity ever since I'd politely declined to join the HOA's voluntary beautification committee 14 months ago. Since then, I had received notices about the color of my mailbox post. Apparently, weathered gray was not an approved color, though it absolutely was, I checked. A notice about my recycling bin being left at the curb until 4 p.m. on collection day instead of the required retrieval by 3 p.m. A notice about my Christmas lights being asymmetrical. And now a notice about icicles that had formed on my gutters as a direct result of a major winter storm that had hit every house in the neighborhood equally. The mailbox post one had been the moment I'd started keeping records, not obsessively, but carefully. A folder on my laptop labeled HOA, where I dropped every notice, every email, every photograph, every note of what was said and when. I had learned my lesson on that one because it had taken me 3 hours of digging through the HOA documentation to prove that weathered gray was in fact an approved color and Janet had simply been wrong, and I wanted that to never happen again. So I opened my laptop and I added this icicle notice to my folder, along with the 30 photographs I had just taken. Then I called Phil. Phil Garner was the HOA treasurer and the closest thing to a reasonable human being on that board. He answered on the 3rd ring sounding groggy in a way that told me he had not personally been up at 7 a.m. taping anything to anyone's door. "Phil," I said, "did the board vote on sending me a fine notice about icicles?" There was a pause. "A fine notice about what?" "Icicles. The icicles on my gutters. I got a notice this morning saying I have until noon to remove them or I'm getting fined $250. Another pause, longer this time, with a quality to it that I recognized as the particular silence of a man who is realizing that something has happened without his knowledge or approval. "Neil," Phil said carefully, "the board did not vote on that. So Janet sent it on her own authority. The board president has limited independent enforcement authority under the bylaws," Phil said, and I could hear him choosing his words the way you choose your footing on an icy sidewalk. but a fine of that size typically requires a board vote and a formal warning period. How long is the warning period supposed to be? 30 days, Phil said quietly. Phil, it's 7:20 in the morning on a Tuesday in January, and there are icicles on every single house on this street. I can see Kevin's from my kitchen window right now. I'll make some calls, Phil said. I'd appreciate that, I said, and we hung up. I ate breakfast. I watched the news, which was covering the cold snap and specifically telling people in our region not to attempt to remove ice and snow from their roofs without professional equipment, because the risk of falls on icy surfaces was extremely high. I found that deeply relevant and screenshotted it on my phone. It was 8:30 a.m. I had 3.5 hours until Janet's noon deadline. I put on proper clothes, heavy winter layers, because my house was drafty and the heating had been working overtime all week, and I went to knock on Kevin's door. Kevin Marsh opened it looking like a man who had been awake for a while and was on at least his third cup of coffee. He was in his 50s, retired from an engineering job, and had a methodical, practical mind that I had always found reassuring. "You get a notice?" I asked. He blinked at me. "What kind of notice?" "About your icicles." Kevin turned and looked at the icicles hanging from his own gutters, which were in the same spectacular condition as mine, then turned back to me with an expression of genuine confusion. "No, why would I get a notice about icicles?" "You didn't get one," I said. "I did." "Only me." Kevin's expression shifted from confused to something sharper. "That's interesting," he said. "Come in." We spent about 20 minutes at his kitchen table going over what I'd received. Kevin had a legal mind despite not being a lawyer. He had spent 30 years dealing with building codes and specifications and regulations in his engineering work, and he had a way of reading documents with precision that I found very useful. He read Janet's notice twice and then set it down carefully. "She doesn't cite the specific language of Section 4, subsection C," he said. "She just references it. Do you have the actual community standards document?" "In my HOA folder." "I can pull it up." "Do that," Kevin said, "because I would bet a significant amount of money that Section 4, subsection C doesn't say anything specific about icicles." I pulled it up on my phone. Kevin leaned over. We both read Section 4, subsection C, which was titled Maintenance of Exterior Structures, and contained language about maintaining gutters, eaves, and fascia boards in good structural repair, free from rot, damage, and debris. It said nothing, absolutely nothing about icicles. It did not mention ice. It did not mention weather-related accumulations. It mentioned debris, structural damage, and rot. "Icicles aren't debris," Kevin said. "They're also not rot," I said. "And they're not structural damage," Kevin said. "They're a natural weather phenomenon resulting from the storm we all lived through 6 days ago." We looked at each other. "She's making it up," Kevin said. "She's been making things up," I said, "or at least stretching things to the absolute limit for over a year now." Kevin leaned back in his chair and looked out his kitchen window at the street, where the cold January sun was doing almost nothing useful except making the ice sparkle. "You know what I think we should do," he said. "Tell me." "I think we should call an emergency community meeting." The Maplewood Estates HOA bylaws, which I had read in their entirety at some point during the mailbox incident and had refreshed my memory on several times since, contained a provision in Article 3, Section 2 that allowed for an emergency community meeting to be called with a petition signed by at least 15% of homeowners in the community. Maplewood Estates had 87 homes. 15% was 13 homes. Kevin and I were 2. We needed 11 more. It was 9 a.m. I had 3 hours before Janet's fake deadline. Kevin started calling people while I walked the street. The cold was absolutely brutal. I could feel it cutting through my heavy coat within minutes, my breath hanging in the air in thick clouds, the icy road crunching under my boots. But I was motivated in a way that cold weather cannot entirely suppress. The Delgados were in immediately, no hesitation. Roberto Delgado looked at Janet's notice, looked at the icicles on his own house, looked back at the notice, and said something in Spanish that I didn't entirely catch, but that his wife Maria translated as, "She can't be serious." They were signatures 3 and 4. The Martinez family down the street was signature 5 and 6. Their teenage son actually came to the door, took one look at the situation, and said, "Wait, I'll get my parents," with the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of neighborhood drama. Tom from across the street, the one who had admired my icicles just days ago, was signature 7, and was so immediately and completely on board that he put on his coat and came with me for the rest of the walk. By 10 a.m., Kevin had gathered 12 signatures by phone and Tom, and I had gathered 8 in person, for a total of 20, which was well above the 15% threshold needed to call an emergency meeting. Kevin typed up the petition on his laptop, printed 20 copies because he is methodical like that, and within 20 minutes we had physical copies with signatures from 20 households on our street. While we were doing this, my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Donna from the HOA board, who had apparently gotten a call from Phil and wanted me to know, in a text she sent, as a private individual and not in my HOA capacity. She was careful to clarify that she had not been consulted about my notice either, and she was concerned about the process. That was useful. I saved the screenshot. At 10:30, I walked the petition to the HOA management office, which was a small room in the community clubhouse about a quarter-mile from my house. The clubhouse sat at the end of Elmwood Drive, the main road through the neighborhood, and the parking lot was a treacherous sheet of ice that had not been properly salted, a fact I noted and photographed. I was wearing my ice cleats for my boots, which I had bought last year after a close call on my own driveway, and I was grateful for them now. Janet Sinclair's car was in the parking lot. Of course it was. I pushed open the clubhouse door and walked into the management room, which was heated just barely above uncomfortable and smelled like old carpet and Janet's perfume. Janet was sitting behind the desk with her reading glasses on and a stack of papers in front of her, looking every inch the bureaucratic authority figure she believed herself to be. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with a sharply organized appearance that she maintained with considerable effort, and she looked up at me with the expression of a person who has been expecting a confrontation and has prepared for it. "Mr. Warren," she said. "Janet," I said, because I was not going to play the formal name game with her. "I'm here to file an emergency community meeting petition." She looked at the papers in my hand. "A petition requires 15% of homeowners. 20 households," I said, and set it on her desk, "which is 23%. She looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then she looked up at me. "The noon deadline still stands." "I've been in contact with Phil Garner," I said, "who has informed me that a fine of $250 requires a board vote and a 30-day formal warning period under the bylaws. I have not received a formal warning. The board did not vote on this fine. The notice you sent this morning is not a valid HOA enforcement action." Her jaw tightened. "Article 7 grants the board president emergency enforcement authority for safety violations." "It does," I said agreeably. "But Section 4, subsection C, which you cited, doesn't mention icicles. It mentions rot, structural damage, and debris. Icicles are a natural weather phenomenon. They're not debris, they're not rot, and they're not structural damage. The citation in your notice is incorrect." I slid a copy of Section 4, subsection C across the desk with the relevant text highlighted. I had printed it at Kevin's. She looked at it. Something shifted behind her eyes, not defeat exactly, more like a tactical reassessment. "The icicles are a safety hazard," she said. "They could fall on pedestrians. The city sidewalk runs parallel to the street, not directly under residential eaves," I said. "My porch is covered. The icicles would fall into my yard. Beyond that, attempting to remove icicles from a second-story gutter in current conditions. The temperature is 11 degrees Fahrenheit and every surface is ice, would itself create a significant safety risk. There was actually a segment on the local news this morning specifically advising residents not to attempt roof or gutter ice removal without professional equipment. I have the screenshot. I showed her the screenshot. She looked at it like it had personally offended her. "You had professional work done on your own gutters 2 days ago," I said. "I have a photograph of the truck. I also have photographs taken this morning showing icicles on every single property on Birchwood Lane except yours. If icicles are a violation of Section 4, subsection C, every house on my street is in violation, but only I received a notice. I'd be interested to understand why." The room was very quiet for a moment. The heating system clicked and groaned somewhere in the walls. "The petition requires the board to schedule a meeting within 14 days, I said. "I trust you'll be in touch with the other board members to get that scheduled." I smiled, turned around, and walked out. The cold hit me like a wall the moment I pushed through the door. I walked across the icy parking lot to my car, carefully, deliberately, using every bit of traction my cleats could provide, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the engine running and the heat blasting, and thought about what came next, because I knew Janet. I had been dealing with Janet for over a year, and I knew that walking away from that desk did not mean she had stopped. It meant she was regrouping. I was right. At 11:15, 45 minutes before her fake deadline, I got a certified letter notification from the HOA management service, not from Janet personally, but from the actual third-party management company that the HOA used, which meant Janet had called them and filed something through official channels in the time since I'd left. The notification informed me that a formal complaint had been logged against my property for failure to maintain exterior structures in compliance with community standards, and that a fine assessment process had been initiated. This was a different thing from the handwritten notice. This was Janet escalating through official channels, presumably because her direct approach hadn't worked. The formal complaint process through the management company did have teeth. They could put liens on properties, which was a serious matter. I called a lawyer. I want to be clear that I'm not a lawyer myself. I have a business background. I'm good at reading documents and understanding contracts, but for this, I needed someone with actual legal credentials. Fortunately, I had a friend, Dave Hutchins, who I'd known since college and who had been practicing real estate and property law for about 15 years. He was in the city, about 40 minutes from my neighborhood, but he answered my call immediately, and I walked him through the whole situation while sitting in my car in the icy parking lot. Dave listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I liked about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Few things. First, the HOA cannot fine you for a natural weather phenomenon unless they're CC and RS. That's the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Specifically include language about weather-related accumulations, icicles specifically, or require you to maintain a heated gutter system or something like that. From what you're describing, they don't have that language." "They don't," I confirmed. "Second, selective enforcement is a real legal issue. If they're only citing you and not your neighbors for the same condition, that's discriminatory enforcement, and it can void any fine they try to impose. Your photographs documenting the identical conditions on neighboring properties are important." "Got them." Third, the formal complaint process through the management company has specific procedural requirements. If those requirements weren't followed, like if Janet initiated the formal complaint before the board voted to authorize it, the complaint can be challenged on procedural grounds. "Phil told me the board didn't vote on the fine notice this morning." "Get that in writing from Phil," Dave said. "A text, an email, anything written. The HOA has to follow its own rules. A lot of HOA overreach happens because homeowners don't know their rights, and HOAs bank on that. You seem to know your rights." "I've been paying attention for about a year," I said. "Keep doing what you're doing," Dave said. "Document everything. Don't remove the icicles, I mean. Obviously stay safe, but don't feel legally compelled to do it by their deadline because that deadline has no legal basis from what you're describing. And if they actually try to levy a fine, send everything to me and we'll file a formal response. Selective enforcement plus lack of proper citation authority plus procedural violation. You've got a strong case. Can they put a lien on my house? I asked. Through the management company formal process, eventually, if they follow all the steps. But that process takes months and each step is challengeable. They're not putting a lien on your house by noon today, I'll tell you that. I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying since 7 a.m. slightly. Not entirely, Janet wasn't done, but enough to breathe. Thanks, Dave. Send me everything you have in your documentation folder, he said, just so I have it, and call me if anything else happens. I texted Phil the moment I hung up with Dave. Phil, I need you to confirm in writing that the board did not vote on the fine notice Janet sent me this morning about Icicles. A text is fine. Phil responded within 10 minutes with a text that said, confirmed. The board was not consulted and did not vote on the notice sent to you this morning regarding Icicles. I have expressed my concern about this to Janet directly. I screenshotted it, sent it to Dave, and added it to my folder. Noon came and went. I was home by then, eating lunch, watching from my kitchen window as the icicles on my gutters did exactly what icicles do when the sun is out and the temperature is 11 degrees, which is absolutely nothing. They just hung there, sparkling, entirely unperturbed by Janet Sinclair's deadline. My phone buzzed at 12:05 with a text from Kevin, watching your house. No sign of HOA enforcement vehicles or Janet. How's the view from your kitchen? I replied. Icicles look great. He sent back a laughing emoji. The community meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Janet was technically obligated to schedule it within 14 days of receiving the petition, and with 20 signatures representing nearly a quarter of the neighborhood, she couldn't really stall it. It was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. In the days between receiving the notice and the community meeting, several things happened that are worth describing because they all fed into what eventually occurred at that meeting and afterward. The first thing was that 3 more households on my street received fine notices. Not about icicles. Those icicles had gradually melted over the following few days as the temperature crept up to a still cold, but less brutal 34 degrees. But about other things. The Pattersons at the corner got a notice about their holiday wreath still being on their door in January, which the notice claimed was a violation of a rule about seasonal decorations being removed within 30 days of the holiday. Kevin got a notice about his mailbox post, which was a different color than mine, but similarly claimed to be a non-approved color. The Martinez family got a notice about their driveway having a crack in it that had not been repaired. None of these were fictional violations. They were all things that could potentially be cited under a generous reading of the community standards. But all 3 households reached out to me, and all 3 of us looked at the pattern and saw what it was. Janet was retaliating. She had seen me with a petition, seen me gathering signatures, seen neighbors aligning against her overreach, and she was coming out with notices in multiple directions to create chaos and intimidate people into backing down. The second thing was that I got a call from Donna, the HOA board secretary, who wanted to talk off the record. We met at the coffee shop on Route 9, which was the closest thing to a neutral territory in our area, and Donna, a quiet, careful woman in her early 60s who had joined the board because she genuinely cared about the neighborhood and had gradually found herself squeezed into a corner by Janet's domineering style, told me some things that shifted the picture considerably. She told me that Janet had been approving HOA fund expenditures without full board votes for at least 2 years. Not enormous amounts, but consistent vendors paid for services that the board had never formally approved, charges on the HOA account that Donna had flagged in board meetings and been steamrolled on. She told me that the management company had flagged some of these expenditures in their quarterly reports and that Janet had handled the responses to those flags herself, without sharing the flags with the rest of the board. She slid a folded piece of paper across the coffee shop table. It was a printed list of HOA expenditure line items, with several highlighted in yellow. The total of the highlighted items was just over $11,000 over a 2-year period. "Donna," I said carefully, "have you shown this to Phil?" "I only put this together recently," she said. "I went back through the records after all of this started, after the Icicle thing. I thought this is the last straw, and I sat down and actually looked at everything." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have done it sooner." "Does anyone know where this money went?" I asked. "I have some ideas," she said. "Some of the vendor names are real vendors who do real work for the community, but the amounts paid to them don't match any invoices I can find in the files. There's a landscaping company that was paid $4,000 in the fall for what the records describe as enhanced grounds maintenance, but our regular grounds maintenance contract covers everything. There's no enhancement in the budget. The grounds look exactly like they always do." I looked at the highlighted items on the list. $11,000. That was HOA dues. That was money people in this community had paid for the upkeep of shared spaces and amenities, diverted into line items that didn't add up. "I'm going to need to show this to a lawyer," I said. "I know," Donna said. I think this might be more than just overreach, Neil. I think this might be something that needs to go somewhere more official." I called Dave that evening and read him the highlights of what Donna had shared. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Potential misappropriation of HOA funds. That's a different level of problem. That's potentially criminal." He asked me to get him copies of everything Donna had and said he'd review it and let me know what he thought we were dealing with. In the meantime, the neighborhood was fully mobilized. The retaliatory fine notices to the Pattersons, Kevin, and the Martinez family had the opposite effect Janet had intended. Instead of scaring people off, it had unified them. Every person who got a notice came to talk to me, and every person who came to talk to me walked away with a clear understanding of what was happening and a strong motivation to show up to Thursday's community meeting. By the time Thursday evening arrived, the parking lot of the clubhouse was absolutely packed. Cars lined both sides of Elmwood Drive for 100 yards in either direction. The temperature was 20 degrees and the air was crisp and still, and people were walking in from their parked cars in heavy coats and scarves and hats, breath clouding in the cold night air, neighbors greeting each other with a kind of energized solidarity that I hadn't seen in this community before. I had arrived early and set up at a table near the front with copies of my documentation. The original notice, the photographs, the Section 4 subsection C text, Phil's confirming text, the news segment screenshot, my neighbor photographs showing identical Icicle conditions on every house. I had a small stack of folders, one for each board member, containing a condensed version of the documentation. Kevin was with me, and Tom and Roberto Delgado and the Pattersons, and the Martinez family and Donna, who had come in her capacity as board secretary, and was sitting at the board table with a slightly pale expression that told me she had made a decision and was living with it. Janet arrived 5 minutes before 7. She was wearing a structured blazer over a turtleneck despite the cold, her HOA board president lanyard around her neck. Yes, she had a lanyard, and she walked to the board table with the energy of someone who was absolutely confident in her own authority and was not remotely expecting what was about to happen. Phil was already seated at the board table. He met Janet's eyes with a look that was not warm. At 7 o'clock, Janet called the meeting to order. She had the composure of someone who had run a lot of these meetings and was used to being the most prepared person in the room. She went through the formal opening business with crisp efficiency and then turned to address the petition. "The petition submitted requests an emergency community meeting," she said. "We are holding that meeting now. The floor is open for the concerns of the petitioning homeowners." I stood up. I walked through everything methodically and calmly. The icicle notice, the incorrect citation of Section 4, subsection C, the lack of board vote, the 30-day warning requirement under the bylaws, the selective enforcement, the photographs of every single house on Birchwood Lane with identical or worse icicle conditions, with 0 notices sent to those homeowners. I kept my voice level and my facts precise, and I passed copies of everything to every board member as I went. Janet interrupted twice with procedural objections. Both times Phil said, quietly but firmly, "Let him finish, Janet," and she stopped. When I finished, Kevin stood up and talked about his retaliatory notice, and then Mr. Patterson talked about theirs, and then the Martinez family. Each person had documentation. Each person had photographs. Each person was calm and factual. The room was very quiet. 70-something people packed into a clubhouse built for maybe 40, the folding chairs creaking, everyone paying close attention. Then Donna stood up. "As board secretary," she said, "I need to raise a matter of official HOA business that I believe the homeowners in this community deserve to know about." She opened a folder on the table in front of her and began laying out the financial discrepancies she had found. Slowly, clearly, item by item, the unexplained expenditures, the vendor payments without corresponding invoices, the pattern over 2 years, the $11,000 total. The temperature in that room, already not warm, seemed to drop about 5 degrees. Janet's composure cracked. Not entirely, she was good, but there was a tightening around her eyes, a slight shift in her posture, that told me she had not seen this coming. "Those expenditures were approved under my discretionary authority as board president," she said. Phil spoke then, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before, measured and deliberate, and carrying the weight of someone who had been patient for a long time and was done being patient. "The board president's discretionary authority is limited to $500 per individual expenditure under Article 8 of our bylaws. Several of these line items individually exceed that amount. All of them required a board vote. None of them were brought to the board. Donna, do you have the meeting minutes from the relevant periods?" Donna produced the meeting minutes, which she had brought in a separate folder. She pointed to the relevant board meeting dates on which the expenditures had been approved by Janet and recorded in the HOA management system, but which had no corresponding board vote in the official minutes because there had been no board vote. The room was no longer quiet. It had moved into a low murmur of the kind that happens when 70 people are all reacting to something at the same time while trying to maintain decorum. "I want to be clear," Phil said, addressing the room rather than the board, "that the board will be commissioning an independent financial audit of HOA accounts for the past 3 years. I'm making that motion now." He looked at Donna. "Second." "Seconded," Donna said immediately. Phil looked at the other 2 board members. One of them nodded and said aye, looking like someone who was relieved that things were finally moving. The other said aye as well. Phil said aye himself. He looked at Janet, who said nothing. "Motion passes 4-0 with 1 abstention," Phil said. "An independent audit will be conducted." Janet said, "I need to consult with legal counsel before." "You can consult with whoever you like," Phil said. "The board has voted. The audit will proceed. And regarding Mr. Warren's fine notice and the fine notices sent to the Pattersons, Mr. Marsh, and the Martinez family, those notices are hereby rescinded, effective immediately, pending a board review of all fine notices sent in the past 12 months for compliance with proper procedure." The room responded with actual applause. Not polite applause, real, genuine, relieved applause from people who had been watching this accumulation of petty authoritarianism build for years and were watching it finally, visibly crack open. Janet stood up, gathered her papers, and walked out. The sound of her heels on the linoleum floor was the last thing, and then the door to the clubhouse opened and let in a burst of cold winter air that honestly felt refreshing. The meeting wrapped up within the hour. Phil stayed after to talk with several homeowners and exchange contact information with me. He thanked me, which I thought was generous. He also said quietly, I should have pushed back harder a long time ago. I told him that it wasn't too late and that what happened tonight mattered, which I believed. Dave had attended the meeting. I'd asked him to come, not as a formal legal representative but as a knowledgeable observer, and he'd driven out from the city in the cold because he is a good friend and because, as he put it, this sounds like something I need to see firsthand. After the meeting in the parking lot, stamping our feet against the cold, he said to me quietly, the financial stuff, that's not just HOA bylaw violations. If those expenditures were fraudulent, if she was paying vendors who didn't perform services and pocketing the difference or otherwise redirecting those funds, that's misappropriation of HOA funds, which is a crime in this state. Depending on what the audit finds, this could go further than a board vote. How much further? I asked. Police further, he said. The audit was conducted over the following 3 weeks by an independent accounting firm that Phil selected. During those 3 weeks, Janet continued to appear at the clubhouse and attempted to conduct HOA business as normal. But the board had voted at an emergency follow-up meeting to suspend her independent spending authority pending the audit results, and Phil was cautioning all communications, which meant her ability to operate unilaterally was essentially eliminated. She sent no more fine notices during this period. The audit results came in on a Friday afternoon in late January, and they were bad for Janet Sinclair. The auditors found a total of $14,732 in expenditures over 2.5 years that could not be matched to any legitimate HOA service or vendor invoice. Several of the vendor company names matched LLCs that had been registered in the state within the past 3 years. When Dave had his office run a quick search on those LLCs, 2 of them traced back to addresses associated with Janet or her immediate family. That was the moment Dave picked up the phone and called the local police department's financial crimes unit. I want to be clear that I did not call the police. Dave did, as a reporting attorney with grounds to suspect financial crime. The investigation that followed was theirs, not mine. But I was contacted by a detective the following week who asked me for copies of my documentation, the original fine notice, the timeline of events, the photographs, everything in my folder as supporting context for the pattern of conduct that had led to the financial discovery. I provided everything. Janet Sinclair was arrested on a Thursday morning in February, just over 3 weeks after the community meeting. She was charged with misappropriation of HOA funds and fraudulent use of fiduciary authority, which are real charges under state law. Her arrest was processed quietly. No dramatic scene in the neighborhood, no police cars in front of her house, though I'm not going to pretend that the neighbors didn't notice when she wasn't at the clubhouse and word began to circulate. It was a small neighborhood and people talk, and by that evening most of Maplewood Estates knew what had happened. She was released on bail but was facing a serious legal process, and the HOA board, now operating under Phil's leadership with Donna as acting president until a proper election could be held, had filed a civil suit to recover the misappropriated funds. The full amount was eventually recovered, a combination of Janet's personal assets and an insurance policy the HOA had on its officers that, it turned out, covered exactly this kind of situation. Phil told me about that with a certain grim satisfaction at the spring HOA meeting, which was a completely different atmosphere from any HOA meeting this neighborhood had apparently experienced in years. But before we get to spring, there's one more winter moment that I need to tell you about, because it's the one I think about most when I remember all of this. It was about 2 weeks after the community meeting, still deep in winter, another cold front having come through that had brought another 6 inches of snow and dropped the temperature back down to the brutal single digits we'd been stuck in for most of January. I was outside shoveling my driveway. It was a Saturday morning, maybe 9 o'clock, the sky that particular pale blue-gray of a very cold, clear winter day, when Kevin came out with his own shovel and started on his driveway, and then Roberto Delgado came out, and then Tom from across the street, and then the Martinez kid, who was apparently getting extra credit in something by helping elderly neighbors, because he went straight to the Pattersons' place at the corner and started shoveling their walk for them. We all worked for a while in the comfortable quiet of people who don't need to say much to each other, the scrape and thump of shovels on cold pavement, breath rising in white clouds, the neighborhood gradually uncovering itself from under the new snow. At some point, Kevin called over to me, "How's your gutters looking?" And I looked up at my roofline where a brand new set of modest icicles had formed overnight along the edge of my gutters, nowhere near as impressive as the last batch but definitely present. "Beautiful," I said. "Outstanding," Kevin said. "Mine too." We went back to shoveling. Down the street, Janet's house sat beige and black-shuttered and quiet, a for rent sign having appeared in the front window the previous week as she apparently relocated while dealing with her legal situation. It looked ordinary in a way it hadn't before, just another house on the street, without the particular weight of authority it had carried when its inhabitant had been running the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. The spring HOA meeting, held in April when the snow was finally gone and the neighborhood was showing the first tentative green of the season, was the most attended meeting in Maplewood Estates history according to Phil, who had been doing this long enough to have a reference point. They elected a new board, Phil as president, which he had resisted but the neighborhood had more or less insisted on, Donna staying on as secretary, Kevin joining as a new board member, which I thought was excellent, and two other homeowners who were genuinely there to help run the place well rather than to accumulate small local power. The Martinez family joined the grounds committee. The Pattersons volunteered to manage the community newsletter. They rewrote the fine notification process entirely, adding explicit requirements for board votes, mandatory warning periods, and this was Kevin's addition, a requirement that any enforcement action for a condition also present on more than 20% of properties be suspended until a neighborhood-wide assessment was completed. This was the anti-icicle clause, as it came to be called in discussion, and it passed unanimously. They also added a specific provision that weather-related accumulation snow, ice, icicles, frost were not grounds for fine notices unless they constituted verifiable structural damage, which had to be documented with a licensed contractor's assessment. This one was Phil's addition, and it also passed unanimously. The HOA was still the HOA. There were still rules, still dues, still committees and meeting minutes, and all the apparatus of community governance that sometimes makes you wonder if civilization is worth it. But it was functioning the way it was supposed to function, as something that served the community rather than something one person used to serve herself. Dave came to the spring meeting as my guest and got a round of applause from the room when Phil mentioned his role in the process, which made him visibly uncomfortable in a way I found very funny. He had driven the 40 minutes out from the city on a Saturday morning, and he looked genuinely pleased to see how things had turned out, which I think is what you want from someone who practices real estate and property law. There's a last piece to this that I've been saving. About a month after everything settled down, I got a call from a woman named Corinne Ellison, who lived in a neighborhood about 30 miles from mine. She had seen some of the social media posts that the Martinez kid had apparently made about what had happened in our neighborhood. I had not been tracking this, and was mildly alarmed to discover it had any social media presence at all, but teenagers are going to teenage, and she wanted to ask me for advice about a situation she was dealing with in her own HOA. Her situation was different from mine in specifics, but structurally identical. One board member using selective enforcement and vague rule citations to target homeowners she had personal conflicts with while ignoring identical conditions elsewhere. No financial fraud as far as Corinne could tell, just pure petty power. I talked to her for about an hour. I told her everything I'd learned, the importance of reading the actual document language before accepting any fine notice as valid, the value of documenting everything from the beginning, the petition process, the importance of identifying board allies like Phil, the power of community mobilization. I told her to be calm and factual and never angry in her communications, because anger gives the person on the other side something to point to and distract from the substance. The thing about HOA abusers, I told her, is that they count on homeowners not knowing the rules. The rules were written to protect homeowners as much as they were written to set standards. Once you actually read the documents, you usually find that you have more protection than you thought. She took notes. I could hear the scratch of her pen. And document the icicles, I said. What? She said. Whatever your version of icicles is, I said. The thing they're citing you for. Document that it's present on every other property before you respond to anything. That's the first move. There was a pause. Did something happen with actual icicles? Something happened with actual icicles, I confirmed. She laughed. I laughed. And then she went off to fight her own HOA battle with, I hope, a better sense of what she was doing and why it was worth doing. The icicles on my gutters that January were the proximate cause of all of this, but they were also, in a way, exactly what Janet had accused them of being, a catalyst, just not in the direction she had intended. The icicles didn't fall on anyone. Nobody got hurt by them. They melted gradually over the following weeks as the temperature fluctuated, releasing water that ran down the gutters and into the ground in the ordinary way that water does when winter finally starts to lose its grip. By March they were gone, and by April they were a memory, something to joke about at the spring meeting and something to tell stories about to people who asked what had changed in Maplewood Estates. If you drove through our neighborhood now, you wouldn't immediately see what was different. Same houses, same streets, same mixture of well-maintained properties and work-in-progress properties that characterize any real neighborhood. The community standards were still in force. There were still rules about mailbox colors, still requirements for lawn maintenance, still guidelines about holiday decorations. The difference was that those rules were being applied fairly, by people who had been elected by their neighbors and who took the responsibility seriously without taking themselves too seriously. Kevin's mailbox post was still the same color it had always been. Turns out it was also an approved color, exactly like mine had been. The fine notice Janet sent him about it cited a regulation that didn't exist in the current version of the community standards, which had been updated 2 years ago without her apparently updating her enforcement template. Kevin thought this was extremely funny and did not change the mailbox post color even slightly as a point of principle. I kept my HOA documentation folder. I still add to it occasionally, mostly routine stuff: meeting minutes, budget reports, the annual community standards update. It's far less dramatic than it used to be. I flip through it sometimes and think about how a piece of cream-colored cardstock taped to my front door at 7 in the morning on a brutally cold January Tuesday had somehow spiraled into financial audits and criminal charges and community governance reform, and a phone call with a stranger 30 miles away who needed to know how to stand up for herself. There are icicles on my gutters right now, actually. It's been a cold February and we had a warm snap followed by a deep freeze, the classic recipe, and the result is a modest but respectable row of ice formations along my roofline that catch the late afternoon sun and throw little fragments of light across my driveway. I noticed them this morning when I was going to my car. I stood there for a moment in the cold, coat pulled tight, and looked at them. They were fine. They were absolutely, completely, entirely fine. I got in my car and drove to work, and the icicles stayed exactly where they were, doing exactly what icicles do, which is nothing at all except exist for a while and then, when the time is right, let go. The last I heard about Janet Sinclair, her case had been plea bargained down from the original charges, but she had agreed to full restitution to the HOA, a period of community service, and a permanent prohibition from serving on any HOA board or similar fiduciary body in the state. Her lawyers had apparently argued for leniency given her lack of prior record, and the judge had been willing to consider it, but the prohibition was non-negotiable and the restitution was complete. Phil called me to let me know when the case was resolved because he knew I'd want to hear it directly. I thanked him. He said, "Neil, I want to tell you something. I knew things weren't right for a long time. I told myself it wasn't that bad, that I was managing it, that rocking the boat would make things worse. I want you to know that I was wrong about that. Rocking the boat was exactly what needed to happen." "You did right when it counted," I said. "I should have done right sooner," he said. "But thank you." I hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of my house, the heating system running steadily against the February cold, the neighborhood outside my window peaceful and ordinary, and genuinely, functionally mine in a way it hadn't quite been before. Not mine as in owned, I mean mine as in a place where I felt like I had a stake, where the rules applied to me the same way they applied to everyone, where the person in charge was accountable to the community rather than the other way around. That's a small thing, maybe. A neighborhood, an HOA, rules about mailbox colors and gutter maintenance and how long your recycling bin can sit at the curb. It's not grand. It doesn't change the world. But it's the world you actually live in, the particular square footage of ground where you come home every evening and shovel snow every winter and watch icicles form on your gutters in January, when the weather does what January weather does, which is exactly what it wants to without any regard for HOA fine schedules or noon deadlines or cream-colored cardstock notices taped to doors in the pre-dawn cold. And when you fight to keep that world fair and functional and honest, when you read the actual documents and take the photographs and knock on your neighbor's door and file the petition and sit in the meeting and speak up, it turns out it's worth doing. Every single tedious, cold, document copying, lawyer calling, coffee shop meeting having minute of it. The icicles outside my window agree.